primary educational interpreter. I'm very excited to start off the new year, and I'd like to start it off by answering the question, what is a primary educational interpreter? For those of you who may not have worked with a deaf individual before, or may be unsure about what my role is as an interpreter in your classroom, I just want to answer those questions and kind of clear that up for you. So the things I'll be addressing today are deafness, hearing aids, the individual education plan, and ultimately answering the question of what is an interpreter. This includes covering the Code of Professional Conduct as well as free and appropriate public education. So what does deaf or hard of hearing mean? It doesn't mean that a child or individual is cognitively impaired. It simply means that their hearing is impaired or is non-existent. So this is a chart that shows you the levels of hearing loss, and depending on the level of hearing loss of a child, IEP or the individual education plan may change. The mode of communication may change, and what we decide to use for this child may be changed depending on their level of hearing. It doesn't mean that they're cognitively disabled. It doesn't mean that they are less intelligent or more intelligent than any other child. It just means that they don't have the ability to hear or hear as well as other children. So commonly, question that is asked right away being an interpreter is, do I lip read, or does the child lip read, or why don't we use lip reading for a child? Well, any child that suffers with moderate to severe hearing loss will lose 70% of what's being communicated by lip reading. Lip reading has really only been proven to be about 30% effective for deaf individuals. So parents or teachers or interpreters that choose to rely solely on lip reading or verbal communication for a child that can't hear will only be 30% effective in their communication with that child. Ways to improve hearing for a child that is moderate to slightly impaired in their hearing level are using an FM system. So this means a teacher might wear the FM system and the child will be able to hear better everything that the teacher is saying. It's important to note that if a teacher were to be using an FM system and leave the classroom, if they don't turn the FM system off, that deaf child will still be able to hear anything that the teacher is saying in private, in the hallway, or away from that student. If a child is using a hearing aid, it just means that it's enhancing the sounds that are already in the room. It doesn't necessarily mean that the sounds are clearer or that they are able to hear as well as an average hearing individual. It just means that it's enhanced. Their level of hearing is enhanced. And depending on the severity of the loss of hearing will depend on how much the hearing aid is actually helping. Another form of hearing aid is a cochlear implant. This doesn't work for every child, and it also destroys all of the residual hearing that child may have in that ear. So without the cochlear implant, the child is completely deaf. They're profoundly deaf without their hearing aid turned on or cochlear implant turned on. However, with a cochlear implant, a child is able to hear significantly better, not to the same level that we hear, but close to the level that we hear. So this is a diagram of an ear. If the cochlear nerves or auditory nerves are disrupted to the ear, there's so many things inside of an ear that could potentially be damaged or be non-functioning that could cause deafness. And because of all these different types of problems that might occur within the ear. There's different levels of hearing that an individual may have and different types of hearing aids that child might use. So, primary education. We all know, being in this field, that education is critical, especially primary education. And why is primary education so critical for a child? Because it's their cognitive development, it's their physical development, intellectual development, their social skills are being developed, their emotional skills are being developed, and their language acquisition is also being developed during this time. Not having the proper access for this deaf individual or any deaf child can cause impairment in all of these things. It can also cause permanent damage in all of these areas if a child does not receive proper education at the primary level. So here is a diagram of brain development. As we can see here, the brain is almost completely developed in language and higher cognitive functions before the child reaches the age of 10. So this time period between the ages of 1 and 10, usually we don't have children in their early age months, but this time is critical for children. You may know of the story of received no language communication, and she was completely isolated. This caused permanent mental retardation and damage to this child. And parents with deaf children that isolate their child linguistically can also cause permanent emotional, mental, and cognitive damage to their child. However, parents and teachers that allow for optimal educational opportunities for their child can help their child become just as successful as any other individual. Here are some pictures of deaf individuals, some of my favorite deaf comedians. You may recognize a few of the deaf actors, but if a deaf child is given the language and communication access that they need, they will be able to grow up just like any other normal child. So the individual education plan is essential. It's a plan that we develop as a team for that child that is tailored to maximize their full learning potential. We're going to address their communication needs, and we're going to choose a language that's most appropriate for this child. Typically, a child that has profound hearing loss will use American Sign Language. They may use transliteration. They may use Signed Exact English. Depending on what the parents have been using at home up until this point, will also determine what mode of communication we'll use for this child. So together, we will work as a team, parents, teachers, interpreters, possibly a deaf and hard of hearing teacher. All of us will work together to develop a plan for this child that will maximize their potential in learning. So what's a sign language interpreter's role in all of this? A sign language interpreter has many different sort of ideas or concepts out there about who they are and what they are. These are some of the few that I feel like kind of identify how I have felt my role is viewed. But today I'd like to really make that clear about what my role is and my plans are for being in the classroom. The bottom line, an educational interpreter and any interpreter is simply a facilitator of communication. That means my role in a classroom is not to judge your teaching style. It's not to assess how well you're teaching. It's simply to give the deaf child the same access and the same language that you're communicating to all the other children for that child. So that child is included under FAPE. All children are included under FAPE, free and appropriate public education. and providing them accessible education. So an interpreter is that access. I am allowing for that deaf child to receive the same education that a teacher is providing for all of their children. An educational interpreter in a primary setting is more than just a facilitator of communication. We also are required to adhere to any rules that the school district has for faculty and staff. We're a part of a team that are working together to maximize the child's education. We're also required to do things like bus duty, as long as it doesn't interfere with facilitating communication. We are allowed to help out in the classroom. We are allowed to help that child or even help other children, as long as it's not hindering the facilitation of communication for the deaf child that we are assigned to. Educational interpreters are also mandatory reporters, meaning if we overhear or see anything that might be harmful towards any child, we're required to report it, including abuse of a parent, abuse of other children, a child threatening suicide, threatening to bring a gun to school. We're required to report that. So what is an interpreter? Interpreter in an educational setting is someone who is certified specifically for their field of education. A legal interpreter is specifically certified to interpret legally. Myself, I am not legally certified to interpret, so if there were a legal certification or a legal situation that were to arise that would require the need of a legal certified interpreter, I would not be able to interpret that situation. Medical interpreters working at hospitals also have their own certifications. They're required to follow HIPAA, just like any other staff would be at a hospital. So a staff personnel at a elementary school is required to adhere to all of the rules of that elementary school or that school district. An interpreter also must have their Department of Public Instruction licensure. This is essential for them to be able to perform their job legally and to the best of their ability at an educational level. An interpreter must have their Educational Interpreter Performance Assessment license, which means that they have been assessed and licensed to work as an educational interpreter in that field. An interpreter also must follow the Code of Professional Conduct. An interpreter may break the Code of Professional Conduct if it's under district rules. Let's say, for example, a school district is requiring an interpreter to tutor a child or to go on bus duty or to serve in the lunchroom. An interpreter is allowed to step outside of their facilitating interpreter roles and fulfill those roles that are required by the school district. So it's important that they're adhering to district standards as well as interpreting standards. What is the Code of Professional Conduct? It is a set of standards developed for interpreters by the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf that is a group of people that govern over interpreters, ensuring that all interpreters are following the ethical standards of professional interpreting and conduct in their field. This includes confidentiality. An interpreter is not allowed to discuss what they see or hear outside of that situation. They're not allowed to use names. They're not allowed to talk about teachers or students or anything relating to that area of field with anyone, because that would be breaking confidentiality, unless it were something that would require mandatory reporting, like a teacher is abusing a student or another student is threatening other students. That would allow for an interpreter to step outside of that. An interpreter must be professional, conduct themselves appropriate to the situation, respect consumers, respect colleagues. So as an interpreter in educational setting, fellow faculty and staff are not only consumers, but also colleagues. We're required to have best business practices, and also that we are continuing education and professional development. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited for this year. I'm excited to be your interpreter, to facilitate communication in your classroom and to work together to maximize this child's educational environment. And I just want to say that together we're changing the world, and we're doing it one life at a time. So thank you so much. Here are a couple of resources that you can go to check out a little bit more about what an interpreter is if you have any questions. I also gave you a link to an ASL website if you want to brush up on a little bit of ASL skills. And just a little more about free and appropriate education, what that means for that deaf individual. If that's something you're interested in, you can check that out. So thank you very much.